Como eu vos dizia há pouco, este primeiro painel foi mais político e falou-se precisamente daquilo que nós queríamos falar, desde logo a necessidade de coordenar esforços. Nós sabemos que alguns países, como Espanha, Noruega, têm tentado tributar os ultra-ricos, mas isto falha sempre. Quando é uma iniciativa solitária, estatal, a probabilidade de falhar é gigantesca e por isso, como a Benedetta bem disse, é preciso um esforço de coordenação a nível europeu, seguido, como bem disse também o Guilherme Melo, de um esforço de coordenação a nível mundial. Esta segunda mesa é mais, eu não sei se teórica, veremos agora, mas é mais focada nas questões de fiscalidade e económicas propriamente ditas, e temos um painel de luxo com alguns dos autores, bem, a Susana Peralta, conhecem todos certamente os que aqui estão na sala, tem trabalhado muito também nestas questões de justiça fiscal em todos os seus sentidos, não só no que diz respeito à tributação dos ultra-ricos. O Cantan é um dos economistas que mais tem trabalhado a nível europeu e global nesta questão também de justiça e de tributação dos ultra-ricos, e a Alison realizou um estudo, ou foi coautora de um estudo que saiu em agosto, que talvez se lembrem porque criou alguma polémica aqui em Portugal, chegou a ter, e eu enviei à Alison, uma resposta do Luís Aguiar Conraria criticando algumas das premissas do estudo, e era um estudo que no fundo dizia ou apontava para os montantes que todos os países estão a perder por não tributarem as mega fortunas, e no caso português, para termos uma ideia, era mais de 3,5 mil milhões de euros, portanto era muito dinheiro, e é um prazer enorme para mim, certamente, que fiz os convites, que os nossos convidados os tenham aceitado e que possam estar aqui hoje, e quem vai moderar e guiar o debate, dispensar apresentações, é o Rui Tavares, que é o nosso co-porta-voz. Muito obrigado.
Alison, yes, come by my side. Olá, boa tarde, muito obrigado a todas e a todos por estarem aqui presentes, várias caras conhecidas, caras novas também. Vamos então dar início a este segundo painel, uma vez que o argumentário para a moralidade da nossa questão, penso que ele já foi perfeitamente estabelecido. Vou dar só uns segundos para que o Cantan e a Alison possam ter a interpretação simultânea. Portanto, dizia eu que, do ponto de vista moral, parece que o argumentário já foi apresentado acerca de como seria necessário, adequado e justo que estas fortunas fossem tributadas. Do ponto de vista também da própria conceptualização do que é que são estas, nós pusemos ali super, hiper, mega ricos, e ainda podíamos dizer hiper, mega, ultra ricos. A ideia é conseguir imprimir junto das pessoas o desmesuramento do tipo de fortunas de que estamos a falar. Eu há pouco dizia que o caso moral está relativamente bem estabelecido. Este é um daqueles casos em que o facto destas super, hiper, mega, ultra fortunas não serem tributadas não é só injusto para as pessoas mais pobres de uma sociedade, nós poderíamos dizer que é injusto até para os ricos, ou seja, os ricos normais, de que nós normalmente falamos e que têm a distância entre eles e as fortunas de que estamos a falar, é de tantas ordens de magnitude que começa às vezes a ser cognitivamente difícil abarcar do que é que estamos a falar. Então eu procuro sempre, até porque sou alguém que vem das humanidades e das letras e não tenho essa facilidade com os números para poder perceber do que é que estamos a falar, procuro sempre estabelecer algumas comparações. Já se falou aqui de quem era o homem mais rico no pós-Segunda Guerra Mundial, Carlos Gulbenkian, bem conhecido em Portugal, porque este arménio que tinha 5% dos lucros do petróleo do Iraque, num dos países com mais petróleo no mundo, e que tinha uma fortuna que seria mais ou menos o equivalente a 5 mil milhões de euros no dinheiro de hoje, portanto 5 bilhões na escala americana, 5 mil milhões na escala longa europeia. Bem, como vocês sabem, deu para fazer um museu, vários museus, uma biblioteca, várias bibliotecas, uma orquestra, um balé, um centro de ciência, vários projetos de filantropia, centros culturais em vários sítios no mundo, em Londres, em Paris, em Jerusalém e, evidentemente, em Lisboa, ainda deixar toda a família Gulbenkian bastante confortável e, na altura, os impostos que nessa época, por exemplo, nos Estados Unidos, sob um presidente republicano, Eisenhower, uma fortuna deste tipo pagaria, poderiam chegar até, nos escalões superiores, aos 91%. Aquilo que Gulbenkian poderia pagar nessa altura na Europa andaria à volta dos 50%. Hoje em dia, os seus homólogos da atualidade pagam, às vezes, uma fração de 1%, ou mesmo nos anos em que pagam mais, pagam 4,5%. Portanto, e são, no entanto, muito mais ricos do que aquilo que ele era na altura. Não estamos a falar de 5 mil milhões agora, estamos a falar de 300 mil milhões no caso de Elon Musk. Entre a Terra e o Sol há 150 milhões de quilómetros, portanto isto dava para ir 2.000 vezes, aliás mais 2.000 vezes para trás e para diante, se cada milhão fosse 1 quilómetro. Se Elon Musk gastasse 1 milhão por dia e não ganhasse nenhum dinheiro novo, basicamente iria demorar mais tempo a gastar o seu dinheiro todo do que o tempo de existência que Portugal, enquanto nação independente, tem na Europa, e são 900 anos. Portanto, ele gastaria mais do que um milénio a gastar esse dinheiro todo. Portanto, além da razão moral, que eu acho que já está bem estabelecida, uma parte do debate que nós temos que fazer é simplesmente o debate cognitivo, que os nossos cérebros consigam começar a abarcar do que é que estamos a falar e conseguir comunicar isso às pessoas comuns. Elon Musk gastou na campanha de Trump 130 milhões de dólares. Isso é o equivalente a um prémio de euro-milhões numa daquelas semanas em que há vários jackpots. Mas, se comparássemos isso com um rendimento de 1.000 euros mensal, isto seria o equivalente a um café, menos de um café, 55 cêntimos. E, portanto, 130 milhões é residual na fortuna dele, sendo que após a vitória de Donald Trump, logo naqueles dias a seguir, dizia-se que a sua fortuna tinha aumentado em 28 mil milhões de dólares, que lhe tinha permitido ultrapassar os 300 mil milhões totais, sem falar da valorização da famosa criptomoeda favorita dele, a Dogecoin, que até pela semelhança entre o nome da criptomoeda e o departamento do Estado que dizem que ele vai dirigir, que é uma consultoria, também valorizou 20%. Feito este introito, a questão é como é que nós conseguimos lidar com essas hiper mega fortunas que estão muito longe daquilo que era conhecido até há poucas gerações atrás nos países desenvolvidos, e como é que nós podemos esperar tributá-los adequadamente e que mecanismos é que nós precisamos de ter para que isso possa ser feito. Eu tenho comigo a Susana Peralta, como o Jorge disse, dispensa apresentações no nosso país, mas que ainda assim vou dizer que é, além de especialista em economia pública e economia política, professora na nova SBE, ou como é mais conhecida, na NOVA. Temos o Quentin Parinello, que é economista também e que vem do EU Tax Observatory. Ele já me disse que pode ser tratado por Quentin ou por Quentin, conforme vocês forem mais francófilos ou anglófilos. E temos a Alison Schultz, que é economista da Tax Justice Network e que, como o Jorge explicou há pouco, é coautora do estudo Taxing Extreme Wealth, What Countries Around the World Could Gain from Progressive Wealth Taxes. Eu vou vou usar a mesma ordem, portanto, começar pela Susana, depois o Quentin e depois a Alison. Vou fazer como a Isabela há pouco, começar em português e depois passar para o inglês quando fizer as perguntas ao Quentin e à Alison. E Susana, eu começava por te propor que olhemos para a realidade nacional, perguntando se há ultra-ricos em Portugal, que é talvez uma pergunta diferente de saber se há ultra-ricos portugueses, não é? Se partirmos do princípio que o Roman Abramovich aparentemente é nosso compatriota, porque conseguiu adquirir a nacionalidade portuguesa, talvez aí fosse certamente incluído nesta categoria, mas além de saber, ou ou melhor, a pergunta de saber se há ultra-ricos em Portugal inclui uma outra pergunta prévia a essa, que é como é que é possível, ou se é possível, saber a verdadeira riqueza existente em Portugal, não só sob a forma de rendimentos, mas de todo o outro tipo de ativos que seja possível contabilizar. E, se sim, se for possível saber essa fortuna, quantificá-la, identificá-la, como é que nós nos poderíamos assegurar, ou como é que nós poderíamos lidar com a questão de fazer com que ela pague a sua devida parte proporcional para a comunidade politicamente organizada que somos nós todos. Obrigado.
Bem, então, queria agradecer ao Rui as simpáticas palavras e cumprimentar a Alison e o Canton por dizer que é um gosto estar aqui, também agradecer ao Jorge o convite e pronto, e dizer que é sempre um prazer contribuir para estes debates que são tão essenciais. Bom, para responder à tua pergunta, se calhar vou começar pelo fim, ou seja, se nós conseguimos ou não conseguimos medir bem a riqueza. Nós não conseguimos medir bem a riqueza nem em Portugal nem em lado nenhum, porque nós temos regimes razoavelmente sofisticados de medição do rendimento, que também, quando nós quisemos, quando se começou a pensar em tributar o rendimento, também se dizia que era impossível, que o rendimento não era tributável porque o Estado nunca ia ter uma máquina de o medir, e a verdade é que os Estados criaram máquinas de medir o rendimento, com as suas imperfeições naturalmente, mas elas existem. Máquinas semelhantes de medição da riqueza não existem na generalidade dos países, ou seja, por exemplo, só para teres uma ideia, só há um país, que é a Dinamarca, onde há um registro de todos os ativos detidos por todos os contribuintes. Portanto, é o único país no qual nós temos verdadeiramente temos uma base de dados, digamos, centralizada, que nós chamamos administrativa, com todos os ativos detidos e, obviamente, enfim, depois podemos pensar o que é que acontece a pessoas que têm ativos offshore e não sei o quê, mas em Portugal e na generalidade dos países, mesmo isso nós não sabemos. Portanto, nós não temos nenhuma base de dados centralizada em Portugal, nem sequer com os ativos detidos pelas pessoas em Portugal, a não ser o ativo imobiliário, para o qual temos um registro, mas mesmo esse, por exemplo, se ele depois estiver em nome de uma empresa, depois para encontrar o beneficiário último da empresa, boa sorte. E, portanto, de facto, nós não somos muito bons a medir a riqueza, e isso é estranho, não é? Porque, ou seja, é uma escolha política, porque se as pessoas, vamos supor, a riqueza que está em offshore, não é? Que está nas Bahamas ou nas Ilhas Caimão, se as pessoas beneficiam de alguma forma dessa riqueza, há registros legais e de propriedade que ligam um beneficiário último a esses ativos que estão parqueados por esse mundo fora em paraísos fiscais. E, portanto, não há nenhuma razão para os Estados democráticos não se apoderarem dessa informação. Claro que isso não pode ser feito à escala de Portugal, não é? Isso é completamente impossível imaginar que uma pequena economia aberta aqui no canto da Europa tem o poder para fazer isso sozinha. Mas é esta ideia de que esses ativos, se de alguma forma se evaporaram, não é verdade. Essa relação de propriedade existe e está registada em algum lugar. E existem imensos intermediários, não só no setor financeiro, como no setor dos serviços, de maneira mais genérica, consultores, auditores, que conhecem essas relações. E era uma forma, enfim, o Estado podia perfeitamente começar a legislar e a obrigar, peço desculpa, vou usar agora aqui a palavra em inglês, ao disclosure dessa informação. Bom, isso não existe. Portanto, isso é a tal quimera do Registro Europeu de Ativos, que era para começarmos isto ao nível europeu, que já não era mau. Já começávamos devagarinho a tentar perceber, a tentar desenrolar os novelos que ligam um determinado ativo à sua propriedade através de uma sequência de empresas e não sei o quê, e depois, lá está, nós encontrar os beneficiários últimos é quase impossível, e pronto, isso é um problema. Depois, nós também somos muito maus a medir o próprio rendimento do capital, ou seja, as pessoas têm ativos, desses ativos decorrem rendimentos, e nós podemos, quando nós pensamos nisto da tributação dos super ricos, podemos debater se queremos tributar a riqueza, que é o estoque de ativos, ou se queremos tributar o rendimento. O rendimento tem uma grande vantagem, que é, nós sabemos exatamente quanto é que é um rendimento, e quando o conseguimos medir, vemos quanto é, não é? Quando conseguimos observá-lo. A riqueza nós temos que ter temos que desenhar regras para avaliar a riqueza, não é? Portanto, por exemplo, todos nós aqui, enfim, as pessoas que têm a sorte de ser proprietárias de bens imobiliários, que é o meu caso, pagamos IMI e há uma fórmula que está no código de IMI que transforma aquele meu bem imobiliário num valor tributário a partir do qual eu pago um imposto. E, portanto, de facto, quando tu queres desenhar impostos sobre a riqueza, isso levanta questões relativamente a como valorizar, enfim, de que forma é que nós vamos dizer quanto é que vale aquele ativo. Que é um problema que o rendimento não levanta. Portanto, depois isso era outro debate. Bom, mas nós, mesmo para medir, dizia eu, o rendimento do capital em Portugal, temos isso, não temos maneira, verdadeiramente, porque a tributação do capital, apesar da reforma do IRS, que foi feita no final dos anos 80, tinha uma ideia do imposto único e, portanto, a ideia era precisamente, ou seja, os impostos sobre o rendimento estavam muito fragmentados, cada fonte de rendimento era tributada de uma determinada forma e o código do IRS, e bem, foi uma reforma, aliás, que nós devemos aos governos de Cavaco Silva, procurou unificar essa tributação e depois, ao longo dos anos, foram-se criando progressivas exceções que fizeram com que, de facto, o capital, a maior parte dos rendimentos de capital não sejam tributados em sede de IRS, como é tributado o rendimento do trabalho. E muitas vezes isso faz, ou seja, a parte desse rendimento de capital, por exemplo, quando nós temos um depósito em bancos, num banco ou numa instituição qualquer financeira, que recebe um juro e há uma retenção na fonte, ou seja, o banco retém imediatamente o IRS que eu devo sobre esses juros, depois comunica isso naturalmente à autoridade tributária, mas depois a autoridade tributária não conjuga essa informação com a minha declaração de IRS e, portanto, isso faz com que nós, por exemplo, hoje em dia já temos para fins de investigação acesso aos dados naturalmente anonimizados das declarações de IRS, mas a parte dos rendimentos de capital que é tributada na fonte, por exemplo, depósitos a prazo, não aparece lá, porque ela não é, como é que se diz, consolidada pela autoridade tributária. Portanto, estamos realmente estamos a navegar muito, muito no escuro. E aqui eu estou a falar, repara, aqui estou a falar do rendimento, não é? Portanto, repara, a máquina tributária arranjou uma maneira de medir esse rendimento, inclusive do tributar, mas depois não o consolida para nós podermos olhar para aquilo e dizer qual é a taxa efetiva de tributação das pessoas, porque há uma parte do seu rendimento que não está lá. Bom, para responder à tua pergunta se há ou não há super ricos em Portugal, eu não sei muito bem o que é um super rico. Em Portugal é ou seja, esses super ricos dos quais falavas, do Elon Musk e companhia, claramente não temos nada que se assemelhe a isso. Portanto, o que nós temos depois é a Forbes, não é, que faz nós temos dois tipos de fontes de informação para irmos ver um bocadinho, perceber o que é isto da riqueza em Portugal, não é? Temos, por um lado, esses tops da Forbes, do top dos milionários e tal, pronto, e Portugal tem a maior fortuna portuguesa, que é a da família Amorim, estará nos 5 mil milhões, mais ou menos, aproximadamente. Pronto, e a Forbes reparem, a Forbes também tem que fazer este exercício que na nossa lei, por exemplo, para avaliar a nossa propriedade imobiliária está tipificada na lei, a Forbes tem exercícios desses para quantificar a riqueza destas famílias, destes grupos empresariais, que também têm que fazer hipóteses, muitas vezes é a valorização bolsista, enfim, têm que fazer umas contas, mas pronto, portanto, essas contas são também elas aproximadas, é o que eu quero dizer. Mas, portanto, a família mais rica portuguesa terá aproximadamente 5 mil milhões, o que já se vê que, enfim, são super ricos, muito modestos relativamente a esses, sim.
No entanto, equivalentes
equivalente ao Gulbenkian,
ao homem mais
sim,
rico do mundo dos
anos 50. É verdade, sim, eu pensei nisso quando estavas a dizer os 5 mil milhões do Carlos Gulbenkian. Esta família Amorim, que é a família mais rica de Portugal, será nem sei dizer isto, 522, como é que se diz isto em ordinal? Mas pronto, é a número 522 do mundo, aposto que o Rui sabe.
Okay,
como é que se diz?
É a 52ª...
22ª, essa parte
okay,
eu sei.
Boa,
22º está... 22º está dentro das minhas parcas possibilidades. Obrigada. 50ª?
Acho que sim.
Bem, aprendi hoje uma palavra, estou tão feliz. Obrigada, Rui. Pronto, portanto, isso dá-nos um bocadinho a ideia, não é? Segundo ainda a Forbes, as 50 famílias mais ricas de Portugal terão uma riqueza de aproximadamente 40 mil milhões, sendo que o top 10 tem metade disto. E, portanto, enfim, lá está, isto é 1/10 do Elon Musk, não é? As 50, enfim, de facto somos um país com ricos dentro desta perspectiva dos super, hiper, mega ricos modesto, pois quando nós pensamos do ponto de vista relativo, comparativamente com a riqueza da generalidade dos portugueses, são realmente super, hiper, mega ricos. Bom, só para dar aqui mais um contexto, pois nós temos outras fontes de dados, portanto, Portugal tem desde os anos 90 inquéritos ao património das famílias, nós temos trabalhado sobre esses inquéritos e, aliás, enfim, devíamos rapidamente pôr cá aquele trabalho que temos feito cá fora, mas eu tenho aqui algumas estimativas. Portanto, o que se faz com esses inquéritos, nós sabemos que esses inquéritos, portanto, perguntam a uma amostra representativa das famílias uma série de perguntas acerca do seu património imobiliário e financeiro. Eles medem mal, ou seja, quando nós comparamos depois com as estimativas de riqueza em contas nacionais, vemos que há muito património que não está ali e depois nós fazemos umas continhas aproximadas para fazer com que aquilo bata certo, portanto isto também são sempre exercícios muito, muito imperfeitos, mas pronto. Mas o top 1% dos ricos em Portugal, portanto aqui estou a falar de ricos em termos de riqueza, de património, património financeiro e não financeiro conjunto. O top 1% estaria mais ou menos acima de 1,4 milhões de euros, de acordo com os últimos dados de 2020. E quando nós olhamos para os 50% mais baixos, são proprietários de entre 3% a 4% apenas da riqueza nacional. E os 1% mais ricos têm entre 1/4 e 1/5 da riqueza nacional, consoante os anos para que olhamos. Pronto, nós temos realmente dados desde os anos 90, desse ponto de vista somos até um dos países com dados de inquérito mais antigos, mas depois somos muito pobrezinhos do outro lado, que é do lado de verdadeiros dados, digamos, administrativos, para nós podermos depois até cruzarmos esta informação e até aferirmos da sua qualidade. E depois temos algo também muito interessante, que é a maior parte da riqueza em Portugal, cerca de 60% é a habitação, portanto a habitação é uma fonte de riqueza muito importante em Portugal. E quando nós outra vez olhamos para os mais ricos de Portugal, para o tal 1%, são verdadeiramente, enfim, os 10% mais ou menos é que têm riqueza financeira, e quando olhamos para os 1%, o que nós vemos como evolução recente é que nos ativos financeiros houve uma diversificação do portfólio financeiro e, portanto, isto, no fundo, dados à União Europeia e uma certa sofisticação dos nossos mercados financeiros, sendo que o mercado financeiro da União Europeia é muito pouco sofisticado comparado com o mercado norte-americano, mas ainda assim os nossos 1% mais ricos, em 1994, 30% dos seus ativos eram em depósitos bancários, eram ativos bancários, e hoje em dia são apenas 10%. Hoje em dia, 2020 era um ano mau para medirmos isto, mas infelizmente é o último que temos, vamos esperar pelo próximo para atualizar os dados. Pronto, posso depois dizer mais coisas, mas acho que já falei demais. Obrigada, Rui.
Obrigado, Susana. Disseste coisas muito interessantes e que me permitem fazer a transição para a pergunta ao cantar, and I'll switch into English now. What Susanna has been telling us is that we don't have enough information because we don't collect these taxes, and because we don't collect these taxes, we don't have enough information, which for me, as an historian, makes perfect sense, because tax collecting and state building are part and parcel of the same dynamics. You don't need to have houses like this, houses of parliament, before politically organized communities start indebting themselves. So the first states to create public debt, they're Italian states in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and they incur into debt. They have to pay their own debt collectively. It's not the debt of the king because they were a republic. So they needed to have their books in order to repay the debt that they incurred in. And in order to have a collective responsibility over it, then they needed to have an institution. And this institution needed to be collective, and hence parliaments, or at least that's the theory about the rebirth of democracy in Europe in the Renaissance that historians like David Stavazaj have. But also in the modern period, in the 19th and the 20th century, in order for you to collect income taxes, you need to know your community, you need to know how much revenue or wages each person has, and you need to make that kind of bookkeeping that at the same time, since it is bureaucratically centralized, also allows you to become a state. So now you work at an EU tax observatory. And the question here is, provided what Susanna has told us, that maybe nation states are not the best tool in order to know all the wealth that exists in a given territory, and maybe an internal market like the one of the EU could be the proper scale to do it. What kind of tools could we develop at the transnational level to start taxing these resources, these assets, and the many ways in which wealth gets materialized? And do you think that the fact that there are technical difficulties in how to do it is all that you need to justify why nation states are not doing it, or it's also a lack of political will? Because if it's a lack of political will, then we have a problem at the EU level, because then we have a lack of 27 political wills, which makes it much more difficult. So the broader question is, can this be done at a transnational level that is not yet a global level? Maybe that then could be the question for Alison, but for now, let's keep us at the next notch of the scale, which is the regional, continental level.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you very much, Rui, for the question, for the invitation. Thank you very much, Jorge, for the invitation as well. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and it's a pleasure to hear the conversation on the G20 resonates here in Portugal. The EU Tax Observatory and its founder, Gabriel Zuckman, worked really closely with the Brazilian G20 presidency. We advised the presidency on that global conversation on how to move forward on the taxation of the super rich. And I'm going to start by addressing the last question that you had on the technical difficulties and the political difficulties, which is a very interesting one. When you look at the taxation of the super rich, regardless of the country you're looking at, all the polls show consistently that there's a majority of global support, of popular support, 60, 70, 80%, sometimes even cross-party reference political support for this. And yet, there is very little, if no transposition into law, even when you have a political majority that supports the transposition into law of the taxation of the super rich. So there's really this discrepancy between the popular demand and the transposition into law, which is usually justified by two aspects. One is the technical difficulty. This is too difficult, we'll never get it. And the second one is the political opportunity. Do we really want to tax the rich? Is it really a good idea? They're going to leave, they're going to stop investing, and are we even able to do that? And I think that the value of the global conversation, and I heard Guilherme, was really happy to see him again, listen to him again on this. The value, the merit of the global conversation, I think, has been to normalize the conversation on the taxation of the super rich, show that this is an issue for the 21st century. This is one of the defining issues of this century, very much like we had an issue with the taxation of multinational companies, we still have, because this is a global issue. Multinational shift their profits elsewhere to avoid taxation. We have the same issue with the super rich. They have global wealth, they store assets offshore that escape taxation, and there's a value for sure in international cooperation. Now, I think that to fully understand this, we need to understand what's the responsibility, what's the added value at the national level, and what's the added value at regional or global level. This is the responsibility to the decision, political decision to raise taxes on individuals is a sovereign state choice. We're going to raise taxes or not. To do that, as Susanna was eloquently saying before, you need to identify high net worth individuals, you need to properly assess the value of their assets, and you need to collect a collection mechanism, so a tax. When you look at the assets of the super rich, this is much more distributed than you and I. Let's say most of us have an income that comes from one, perhaps two sources. Most of this income is a domestic source of income. The assets of the super-rich are much more scattered around the globe, and sometimes they're hidden between a number of structures, of opaque structures, to prevent tax administration from knowing that you actually own these assets. So there are a number of technical difficulties, and this is why we need a regional or a global level to improve this. Now, counterintuitively, the higher you go, the easier it will actually be. Very counterintuitively. Billionaires' assets are mostly financially publicly listed assets, which means that tax administration knows the valuation of these assets for very simple reasons. They're listed on stock markets, so there's an understanding of who owns this and what is the market value, so the assets value of this. This is the message we pushed at the G20. The technical difficulties to address the taxation of the super, hyper, mega rich, I can't remember how many adjectives you put here, might actually be even easier than taxing the millionaires. But then there's a political question, of course. Do we want to restrict that reform, that conversation, to just the billionaires? And I think that you made an eloquent case that perhaps the problem is bigger than this. Perhaps we also need to look at centimillionaires. Perhaps we also need to look at people over 10 million, 5 million. The lower you put the threshold, the bigger the technical conversation starts. Because, of course, the lower the threshold is, the more diverse the assets are, the more difficult it is to track when it's offshore, the more difficult it is to value. We made the case in the international report we submitted to the G20 this year that there is a lot to build from past success of international tax cooperation, including the introduction of automatic exchange of bank information. So this is a global reform that took place that was agreed to in 2016, if I'm not wrong, 2014, I have a doubt now. That basically requires banking institutions to share with tax administration whenever they have data on financial assets of taxpayers, and this information is automatically shared with other relevant tax authorities. So let's say you're a Portuguese taxpayer, you have assets hidden in Switzerland and your bank account is in Singapore. The financial institution of Singapore is required now to identify the assets that are in Switzerland and share them with the Portuguese tax authorities. This is a success of international tax cooperation. Now, tax authorities have access to much more information on financial assets. Let me just stress that this is far from being perfect, and I suspect Alison may say more about this later. But this is still a progress, and it shows that, yes, this is possible to have international agreement or regional agreements to improve the fight against financial secrecy. Now, looking at your first question, it's the base of what we want to do, the tax base of what we want to tackle. It will be a very important conversation. In the report commissioned by the G20, we said a number of things. First of all, we said for all countries for which we have data, this is very visible. Official tax data show that the super rich pay less taxes than the rest of the population, taking into account consumption taxes, income taxes, and even corporate taxes paid indirectly by shareholders. 1. 2, they pay less taxes because they structure their wealth so that they don't generate taxable income. And 3, well, if you want to tackle this, raising income tax is likely not to work because they don't have taxable income. So you need a solution that is based on wealth, which is much less manipulable than income. Now, there is information on wealth when it's financial assets, when it's the super, hyper, mega rich. The lower you put the threshold, the more technical difficulty you will have. But this is a political conversation that requires a global support for national initiatives. And this is how I wanted to conclude. I don't think this is relevant to oppose national initiatives and global initiatives. This is typically the scenario where global tax corporation should support national initiatives in taxing the super rich. It's not only about empowering tax administration to do so, this is also about setting an agreed taxation level of the super rich at international level to prevent the race to the bottom, very similarly to what we've seen on multinational corporations. And I'll stop there, happy to answer any other questions afterwards.
Merci, Quentin. And now on to Alison. So we've established that morally it is justified to tax this kind of huge wealth. We know that it is difficult to track it, but not impossible. Neither Susanna nor Quentin said that it will be more difficult than it was in the 19th and the 20th century to start and building the basis from which to tax income. Now, what I would like to address with you is the question of opportunity and the need to do it. We know that states now, and not only states, but the politically organized community at a regional and even global level needs to have a lot of money now. That there's been talk of increasing defense budgets, and that's lots of money. Preparedness against extreme scenarios and fight against climate change, lots of money as well. If you need to compensate poorer countries from what they lose in the fight against climate change, again, lots of money. And we could talk about other items that are expensive. Then there are usually two positions regarding how to get this money, other than just going on the debt market. But let's talk about the assets that there exist. People on the left usually say there are huge fortunes in the world. We have these super mega ultra rich that are not even comparable or easily to grasp how rich they are, and even a sliver of their wealth could be put to very good use in all the things that we need now. And we see that some of these super mega rich and their supporters in the more conservative camp say, if we need to increase, for instance, the defense budget, where we can find lots of money? It's in social securities and welfare programs. So this boils down to a really quite dichotomic, quite simple question of, do we want a democracy or do we want an oligarchy? Do we want to take money out of social programs? Because since there's so many people, these programs usually have to have lots of money, and divert it into the things that, the current moment of the world tells us that we can discuss one by one, but that we need to have huge packets of money? Or should the super rich pay even just a little bit more than what they pay, even not making them pay proportionally as much as the normal people in the world pay, in order for us to get this money? So my question is twofold. One, Jorge has already announced it. You have made studies in how much is this money, how much is this money nationally. You have received criticisms, particularly in Portugal, of an economist like Luís Aguiar Conraria, who says it's not that much money, it's not as much as you say it is. So maybe you would like to address these criticisms. And then also, because this will help people who are not used with these kinds of numbers realize what good use could they be put to, what could we do with this money? What would it allow us to do now in the things where you need very much to have, either for new social welfare programs, fighting climate change, preparedness against all kinds of events like pandemics, wars, climatic, meteorological extreme events, etc. We could use this money, and how much are these programs, and how much could we collect by taxing the super rich?
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the question and for having me here. I would like to start with this dichotomy which you were talking about, like the two strands. One of them talking about let's just tax the super rich a little bit or maybe a little bit much, depending on how extreme we are. And the others who just say let's cut expenses everywhere. I'm very much aware of the second strand as well. First, because I'm originally from Germany, where austerity is always very strong in their voices. Second, because I'm a financial economist, and I think many financial economists, though not all, also like to suggest that we should cut everywhere and cut and cut and cut. And I think with this question, it has been shown that we cannot have more austerity, that we cannot cut more, because this is just nothing which our societies and our democracies can afford at the moment. And with that statement, I would like to continue with the main reasons why we need to tax extreme wealth. I think the first reason has become very clear in several statements today. The first reason is we need the money, and we cannot get the money by cutting other parts, because this will destroy social cohesion. We can also not have all the money by increasing debt level, because this is really difficult, especially for countries who already have high debt levels. But there's also another second very important reason, which is obvious, but I think it has not been, maybe not been promoted enough today. And this is that we really need to fight inequalities. And these inequalities, we need to fight them not only because we dislike them, because maybe we are leftists or we are Greens or so. We need to fight them because they are very, very dangerous. These inequalities actually destroy, again, social cohesion, and they also destroy the trust in democratic institutions. And this is something that has been shown by academic studies all over the place. So what we do if we allow these levels of inequality is that we actually risk our democracies. We facilitate authoritarian regimes. So it's not only that the right wings, like Benedetta has said, the right-wing politicians like to cut taxes and increase inequality. It's also that high levels of inequality set the ground for authoritarian regimes, something that we all risk at the moment in Europe. And I think the super nice thing about having a tax on extreme wealth here is that wealth inequality heavily overlaps with other kinds of inequalities. So we have, for instance, men have 50% more wealth than women. We have, on the one hand, women and racialized minorities who usually rely heavily on labor income, while white male people, or few white males, get a lot of income from their extreme wealth, and we tax the labor income of the racialized minorities and of the women more, so they even carry a higher burden. So we really need a wealth tax to fight these inequalities, and the wealth tax is very nice because also the wealthiest are also privileged in all other kinds of dimensions. Third, and this is something which you have said, but I just would like to reiterate it, we need to restore the progressivity of our tax systems. If you ask people in almost all advanced economies, but also in all democratic countries, if you ask them how should the taxes be distributed, there's a huge majority of people, even super conservative people, who would say those who have higher earnings should bear a higher burden. Stronger shoulders should carry more. That's like a consensus among most democracies. At the same time, or maybe not, let me say something first. So we see that we have established this in our salary taxation. So if we look at how much salaries are taxed, in how much labor income is taxed, we actually see that these marginal rates are progressive. If I have a higher income, I will pay a higher rate of this income to the state. So we have this progressivity here in theory. However, when it comes to the super rich, this is not working anymore. Like Quentin has said, those people do not get their income from labor. They mainly get the income from capital. And even the income from capital, they usually would not realize this income. So they just hold the shares, for instance. They don't sell the shares, so they don't pay the tax they would pay if they have labor income. So in order to restore progressivity, which we all want, we need to tax extreme wealth. So much to the reasons for why we should tax extreme wealth. I would now like to come to my study and talk a little, or our study, sorry, of the Tax Justice Network, and talk a little bit about what we found there, what is the potential for taxation. I would first like to talk about what we found, and towards the end of my talk, address the criticism that have been raised regarding our study and similar studies. So what we did in our study is that we estimate the potential of having a very, very moderate progressive tax on extreme wealth. So what did we estimate? We estimated the revenue potential of a tax on the top 0.5 wealthiest of the population. So just to get an idea of who these people are, for instance, in Portugal, these would be 42,000 persons, and these 42,000 persons are persons who own at least 2.7 million euros. They would not be taxed on all these 2.7 million euros, only on anything they own above 2.7 million euros. So who are these 42,000 people? These 42,000 people possess about 20% of all private wealth that exists in Portugal. They have seen their fortune grown more than twofold over the last 25 years. So over the last 25 years, when most of the population has not accumulated any wealth, they have more than doubled their wealth levels. They are able to do so because if you're super rich, you can realize very, very high returns on wealth. There are academic studies which show that the super rich investors are able to generate 18 percentage point more investment returns from investments compared to an average investor. What does it mean? Let's take me as an average investor. I would usually get like 5% return on my investments. If I'm a super rich, I can invest way better and I will get on average 23% returns. So those people are able to increase their fortunes a lot because they can invest better or more profitable than average investors. They also, and this has been said by Benedetta before, have a greater responsibility in many of the crises we see today, especially in the climate crisis, where, and I just want to repeat the number that Benedetta has said before, the 1% richest of the globe emit as much CO2 as the lower 2/3 of the global population. So they have a high responsibility, they have a lot of wealth, they are able to really increase this wealth a lot, and at the same time, they pay a lower share of taxes compared to the average middle-class family. So it's quite obvious, I think, that there are good reasons to tax them. So what could we gain from taxing them? We estimate for Portugal that the gain would be about 3.6 billion euros. And I think in this room, because I'm not from Portugal, I think all of you in this room have way better ideas on how to use this money and where this money is best used. I just wanted to put the number in comparison and looked up some education spending statistics for the same year as our studies. And for instance, these 3.6 billion euros would allow Portugal to expand education spending by 1/3. This is a lot. This is a lot of additional teachers. This is a lot of additional support programs for those who need it most. It's a lot of money. If we look at this at a global level, these revenues would be in total, let's say we have these systems in place in every country in the world or in every country where we have data, the revenues would be about 2 trillion euros. This is enough to fund the external climate funding, which has been at the core of the discussion of the last COP. The external climate funding for the developing countries could be funded twice by this amount. So the money is there. And just to end on the estimates that you get an idea of how much these people would be taxed, what I suggest is nothing radical at all. So the suggestion is to tax the top 0.5% only on the money which makes them the richest. So we had this 2.7 million euros. On any euro you own above 2.7 million, you would be taxed at 1.7%. So you pay 1.7% tax. And those who are even richer would pay up to an amount of 3.5% on everything they own. In Portugal, for instance, that would be on anything they own above 10 million euros, they would pay 3.5%. So this is what we find that could be received or that could be achieved by setting national or by implementing national taxes on extreme wealth. And now coming to the criticism. What we estimate here, I think there are two types of things which we can distinguish. First, of course, the data is never perfect on how much money people have. We use the data from the Paris School of Economics, like the colleagues of Quentin, who provide the World Inequality Database, who have done huge efforts to estimate the wealth that exists in the different countries. Of course, this data is far from flawless. Any one of you who has worked with data knows that data is always super problematic. But the data is the best we have, and the data is way better than other databases which heavily underestimate the wealth. I think that's the first level where you can always debate, is the data correct here, is it correct there? We say the Paris School of Economics is one of the best economic institutions in Europe, so we trust their data. The second criticism is on how much of these estimates could actually be raised. And this is actually a question on, we believe that people have that much money, but can we even get the money from these people? And I think here the discussion is way more critical and relates back to the points we have heard before. So yes, we estimate the potential. And this potential can only be realized if the wealth tax is implemented in a good way. And in our study, we don't invent this newly, we just summarize all the academic evidence which is out there on how you should actually implement national or also regional wealth taxes. And I would just like to mention 3 points, because then I think we can go back to questions, maybe also go to questions on the details. And I think there are 3 main points which really need to be done correctly in order to avoid mistakes that have been made in the past. The first one, and this is something we try to do with this example of taxing the top 0.5%, is that you really need to set a high bar. So the thresholds need to be super high. First, and this has been explained by Quentin very well, is that this is more easily to administer. So in Portugal, you would just have 42,000 people. It's quite easy to see, or not easy, but it's not like a bunch of people whom you all have to oversee. Secondly, and also importantly, if you set this very high bar, you really avoid to hurt the middle class and also to hurt the economy, because you would hurt their spending ability. So this is not a tax on usual property like normal houses or like the one house which you get from your grandma. This should be a tax on the super rich. Second rule, you should not exempt any asset classes. So if you start saying, yes, we tax financial assets, but we don't tax artwork. Yes, we tax houses, but we don't tax the yacht. What will I do as a super rich? I will just put all my money in the yacht, and I will put all my money in wherever it is exempt. Therefore, we have a big exemption in this proposal already, because I will only be taxed on everything which I own above 2.7 million. These 2.7 million I can put anywhere I want. But anything above, no matter if it's artwork, no matter if it's houses, no matter where I want to put this money, will be taxed. This is also important, because if people start shifting their money, it's not only problematic because they avoid taxes, but it's also problematic because it's inefficient from an economic perspective, because they don't put money where it's best used, but they put money where it's least taxed. The third important rule is very much related to what Quentin has said. We need to establish other measures to make sure this tax is paid and to make sure the state has the capacity to pay it. And at the forefront of these measures are transparency measures on the ownership of assets. So we need to know, the state needs to know who owns which company, who owns which yacht, who owns which house, who owns which part of another high-value asset. We cannot rely on self-reporting here, because people will under-report. And this is something which has been pushed forward a lot already within the European Union with the beneficial ownership registries. Beneficial ownership means we always need to know the beneficial owner. We need to know who actually gets the benefits from an asset and not who has legally registered the asset. And once we know that, and then we combine it with good exchange of information, like said by Quentin, so we have a good exchange of the beneficial owners who own something in Germany with the beneficial owners who own something in Portugal. This will make it possible to get close to this potential of collected tax revenues.
Well, thank you, Alison. I was going to make a second round, but because we are short on time now, I will turn the floor to the audience. Maybe if you want, while receiving questions, you can squeeze in arguments and some stuff that you've forgotten or that was raised by other speakers, like Susanna was the first to speak, so maybe she would want to add something that was motivated by what you just said. And while you put your earphones back again, so that I can switch into Portuguese, I will report a fun fact. We were talking about Gulbenkian as the richest man in the world and living in Portugal. In order for us to find a Portuguese richest man in the world, we have to go, at least from what I was able to research, to go to the 2nd century Anno Domini, where there was a guy called Lamechus. He was a horse rider, an agitator, and he was the Cristiano Ronaldo of... he died in, I think, 127, and he had the equivalent, the people who have researched this, of 12 billion euros. So more or less what we should pay for the Portuguese National Health Service, and way less than what the richest man in the world now have, and at least he did something to get it, which was to ride horses. He died at 42, and of course it was much more difficult to hold on to that kind of money and then have other people inherit it. That money was enough to sustain the Roman Empire army for a year, which is a lot at the time, but today the super rich can, if they would want to buy arsenals from failing states, if they want to have armies, they could surely pay for them because they have more money than half of the countries in the world. So I will now switch into Portuguese now that I have managed to bring Lamechus, the Cristiano Ronaldo of the Roman Empire, to our discussion. Quem tem perguntas, estou a ver uma já ali, outra ali. Vamos tentar equilibrar também, não sei se há perguntas de mulheres, se houver vou intercalar, assim tem via verde para termos uma pergunta equilibrada. Por favor, diz o teu nome ao fazeres a pergunta para registarmos aqui. Muito obrigado.
Okay. Boa tarde a todos, meu nome é Pedro. Eu queria fazer primeiro um comentário que é para ficarmos um bocadinho contentes e depois uma pergunta que eu acho que nos vai deixar se calhar um bocado tristes, também deixa. O comentário é sobre aquilo de olharmos para trás e para o Gulbenkian e que ele era super rico. Há uma coisa positivo que nós temos de pensar, que é a pessoa mais rica do mundo há 200 anos apanhava uma doença qualquer e morria, não é? E nós hoje em dia, mesmo alguém que recebe o ordenado mínimo, vai ao SNS e recebe uns comprimidos e passado 2 semanas ou 3 está curado. Portanto, nesse aspecto somos mais ricos. Agora a parte chata, tem havido alguma equivalência, tem de ser um esforço global, tal como na climate change, por exemplo. E nesse problema acontece uma coisa que é, se 40% dos países, ou 60% ou 70% quiserem, o problema fica quase resolvido, mesmo que os outros 30% não façam nada, até porque vai haver mais tecnologia e os outros países vão acabar por adotar, porque a energia fica mais barata e por aí fora. Neste caso da taxação, o incentivo é ao contrário, que é quantos mais países se juntam a um pacto para taxar os super ricos, mais beneficiam os países que não fazem isso, porque vão absorver os mega ricos de todos os outros países. Temos um caso em particular que é os Estados Unidos, e dentro dos Estados Unidos até lá dentro há competição. Estávamos a falar muito no Elon Musk, ele não está a fugir de um país para o outro, ele está a fugir de um estado, da Califórnia para o Texas, para pagar menos taxas. Portanto, isto até era mais uma pergunta para o painel anterior, porque eu tenho muita dificuldade em ver os Estados Unidos a alinhar nesta taxação global, se nem lá dentro eles conseguem equilibrar isso. Portanto, os Estados vão ter sempre autonomia para ter os seus rácios, as suas taxas, e vai ser muito difícil de competir com eles. E pronto, e é isso. Como é que resolvem esse problema?
Em relação à tua primeira pergunta, deixa-me só notar uma coisa, é que o argumento também se pode ver ao contrário agora. Se por acaso a tecnologia avançar e a ciência de maneira a que as pessoas possam viver muito mais, ou inclusive a não morrer, com o tamanho das superfortunas que temos hoje em dia, podemos ter a certeza que uma das primeiras pessoas a conseguir fazê-lo vai ser um desses super ricos. E como muitos dos autocratas que nós temos no mundo, os Putins e por aí afora, também são super ricos, embora com a fortuna oculta, significa que uma das vias que nós temos tido de transição da autocracia para a democracia, que era uma coisa que nós podíamos esperar, ao menos que o tipo morra e depois de morrer que possa haver uma transição, até isso pode ficar adiado, 20, 30, 50 anos, 100 anos, se for preciso. Ou seja, nós aqui tivemos a discutir o argumento económico, mas há um argumento moral complicadíssimo para isto, que é, será que alguém deveria ter tanto dinheiro que permita aceder a coisas com o avanço tecnológico no domínio da inteligência artificial, das redes sociais, por aí afora, que estejam completamente inacessíveis ao comum dos mortais? Será que esse tipo de mundo de divergência entre seres da mesma espécie que nós buscamos? Porque o Lamecos morreu aos 42, apesar de tudo, quer dizer, na altura era assim. Mais perguntas? Eu iria tentar juntar pelo menos 2, talvez 3, para os nossos oradores. Então, ali atrás, diz-me também o teu nome. Não. E liga o micro. Sim.
A pergunta que eu queria fazer era em relação à parte de comunicação, porque falámos muito sobre as razões que nos levam a estar aqui todos, acho que são bastante óbvias. A maneira como fazer isto acontecer é mais complicada, é verdade. Mas acho que estamos num momento bastante interessante, porque a União Europeia prepara-se para fazer um grande investimento em defesa, que é um tema que é mais sensível aos partidos da direita e da extrema-direita. E a pergunta que eu queria fazer é se não temos aqui uma boa oportunidade de trazer este assunto para a frente, usando razões que são mais sensíveis à direita, para termos finalmente a nível europeu dinheiro para, independentemente se concordamos ou não com isso, mas finalmente de usar esta taxação dos super ricos para até trazer para a frente coisas que a direita é mais sensível. Isto para fazer com que partidos, para que, enfim, tenhamos mais força nos parlamentos por toda a Europa. É isso.
Muito obrigado, André. Ok. Joana.
Ok.
Força.
Posso fazer a pergunta em inglês, não sei se facilita ou não. So, my question is somehow, could sound like a bit prosaic, but the thing is, we have this perception that really wealthy people, we always speak about really wealthy men, like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or whatever. So, my question is this perception real? And if so, I mean, this richness regarding men and not women. So, yeah, so my question is gender biased, in a sense that if that perception is true, could that be somehow connected to a non-feminist way of organization of our world? And if so, do you think that real feminist policies towards taxation and finances could help somehow in turning things around, basically?
Muito obrigado. So what I will do now, I will start backwards with Alison, then Quentin, and then Susanna to end. We have one question on the global effort that's needed and the effects that can be of competition between not only nation states but even federated states in federal political entities like the United States or even Brazil. One on communicating why this is needed, and could this help us convince larger sections of the society other than the progressives that are already in favor of progressive taxation. And here I'd like to squeeze in something that your talk reminded me of, Alison, which is if we tax the normal rich, so to say, the ones with 5 million or 10 million, could that, in a sense, if it was well framed, could that help us then tax the super rich, the ones with the billions and not the millions? Because if I were a millionaire, if I had like 5 million, and they were taxing me more, I would probably react saying, tax the Amorim family, because they have 1,000 times more than me. So I would grab my pitchfork and start, one of these feudal mutinies to try and, make the dukes and the marquises and not the lower counts pay their stuff. But it may work the other way around, as we know. They could just say, go grab it from Social Security and the health system. And then the question from Joanna about the genderedness of wealth in our world, and what does it say about the organization of our society. So first Alison, then Quentin, and lastly Susanna.
Thank you. So I would not go into detail on the last question, but just say yes to everything that has been raised. So I would completely agree with all the arguments. Then come to the second question, which you just rephrased about the fairness among the super rich. And I think that's very relevant, because we always have the idea that the millionaires don't want to be taxed, which kind of makes sense. But there are studies, for instance, a study which was conducted by Patriotic Millionaires. Of course, it's a biased organization, but they surveyed millionaires all over the world. And of the surveyed millionaires, 60% agreed that they would be willing to pay a tax if also other millionaires pay it. So, of course, I don't want to pay if all the other people in my same situations don't pay either. But many of the millionaires are also not so much against that, or against of the billionaires. And then I would also like to comment on the point that people will simply relocate, because this is something which is often raised as a problem, especially with national wealth taxes. And I think first, yes, we can say that the broader the level where we implement wealth taxes, the better. So it's very problematic if you implement wealth taxes, for instance, on a sub-state level, like it has been done in Spain, on the Comunidad Autónoma level. That's very problematic because people can easily relocate. However, when it comes to national measures, we have some of this anecdotal evidence which has been cited, where individual people have left after wealth tax has been increased. However, once it comes to systematic evidence, we have several papers now, and the research group is very active on this at the moment. There's a lot of economists working on these issues. And actually, there's no study which finds a massive relocation. It's just not what is happening. The rich people like to stay where their families are, where the education system is good, where they feel connected because of culture. And it's not that they simply relocate once there's a wealth tax. That's just not happening. There are some number estimates for this, which has been done at the London School of Economics, so very, very reputable economic institutions. And they estimate that a maximum of about 3% of those affected by the tax will move. In our estimate, we already include this number, so we downward bias the estimate such that we could assume some people are leaving. Having said that, once we would have maybe even more radical wealth taxes in place, of course people might move, but there are measures that can be taken to avoid them escaping the tax. So you can, for instance, tax people based on the number of years they have lived in your country. This has happened. This is also done in other parts of the taxation code. For instance, in Germany, we have a part of these exit taxes that once you escape the country or you go out of the country, you pay for the time you have lived in the country because you have used the education system, because maybe you have grown your fortunes there, and so on. So even if this is a problem, we have measures to counteract it. I think the way bigger problem than people really relocating physically is that people relocate their assets, and that's where we need the solutions which have been mentioned by Quentin earlier, that we need to have good measures to avoid that people just hide their assets, for instance, in low-tax jurisdictions.
Thank you. Alison said a lot already, so I'm going to be very quick on the gender distribution. First of all, yes, there are more men that are billionaires than women. There are also, on the lower bound, on the bottom 50%, there are also more women than men, and the tax system being more reliant on the bottom 50% on consumption taxes tend to tax more the bottom 50 where you have more women than men. So there's an inequity angle to the tax system that is definitely interesting to explore. On the second question on the framing, I think, I don't know, I think the framing is a bit tricky. I think Very interestingly, it's a political conversation. I agree with you. The political framing matters a lot. I'm not even sure that the defense spending is the best angle. Let me just give you one other example from my native country, which is France, where we had, for a very brief moment of a couple of months, a conservative government that campaigned heavily on saying no taxes, no taxes, no taxes, came into power and included in their budget a minimum tax on the rich that was inspired by the work we did at the G20. It was very poorly designed, but they were so desperate for money that they put it in. And I think that the political context, the heavy need for public funding, the very visible evidence that the super rich pay less taxes than the rest of the population, and the impact on global tax consent puts a huge pressure on policymakers to redesign their tax system so that it's progressive. So you can justify it by, defense spending, just meeting the budget, not having deficits, making sure that we have enough airtight climate policies. But I think that the normalization of this idea in 2024 is actually giving a lot of grounds for political parties in the different political spectrum to do that. On the risk to relocate, I think that Alison said a lot. Of course, the global level is ideal. Then again, I think that we need to be very conscious that we're faced with a geopolitical fragmentation, and it's very unlikely that any global tax agreement will be signed by all countries in the world. So it's about designing agreements that work without everyone on board. One way to do that is also to do exit taxes. So Alison mentioned this. You have two polar political technical models at the moment. One where you've lived 50 years in a country, you became really rich, you decide to leave January 1st of next year, you're not owing any taxes in that country anymore. The other one is the US model, where you've spent 1 week there, your parents were in the US when you were born, you never set foot in the US again, you're supposed to keep paying taxes there. So it's very efficient against the risk of tax evasion, but it's also very heavy on the middle class. And Alison argued, and I think we agree with this, that a sort of compromise model that would target the super wealthy and just make sure that whenever they want to leave, it's okay, freedom of movement, but they should keep paying taxes to the countries where they were resident for a number of years. We can do that now. We could not really do that 10, 15 years ago. We can do that now because of the progress of international tax cooperation. We can do that now because of an automatic exchange of bank information. Tax administrations have access to your assets when you're in another country. Finally, the US do not want to implement a global standards, very likely under Trump, very likely with the US Supreme Court being very conservative after Trump. The agreement on the minimum tax on corporations has a lot of flaws, but an interesting idea, which is if you do not tax multinationals, other countries will tax them. Why not replicate that for the super rich at the global level? If the US do not want to tax their billionaires, if these billionaires have assets in your country, tax them instead of the US. So this is something we proposed in the G20 Commission report to Brazil, and hopefully will be discussed in the years to come.
Susana.
Queres que eu responda em português? Okay, I'll just...
Já podemos... Ok, como quiseres, como preferires.
Não, como tu preferires.
Como tu preferires.
Okay, I'll just do it in English then. Okay, so no, I think it's important. I'd like to maybe move one step back, because I think it's important that we think about the optimal design of taxation in a multilateral world with mobility, with factor mobility. And the reason, for instance, why in Portugal we don't tax personal income or corporate income at the municipal level is precisely because of mobility. So the design, the optimal design of a tax system in principle entails the taxation of a tax base at a level that encompasses its possibilities of mobility, let's say. So, for reasons that we would spend another afternoon discussing, we entered this big globalization phase, which has many different benefits, without tackling the taxation issue properly. And it's interesting because when you look at the European Union, already in the Treaty of Rome, there are provisions against tax competition in VAT, in indirect taxes, because there was a worry that with mobility that people would just do cross-border shopping in order to avoid paying VAT, IVA. And that's built into the Treaty of Rome, and that's why we have a Diretiva do IVA. And for instance, when Portugal wanted to do something, inflation mitigation policy, whatever, that didn't make much sense. But anyways, they needed the authorization of the European Union, because you can't just play around with VAT without having the authorization of the Commission. And that was never done for direct taxation, no corporate, no personal income taxes. Now, corporate income taxes, tax competition started to be an issue somewhere in the 90s, and it's been like almost 40 years until now we eventually are moving in the direction of some form of cooperation. And when it comes to taxing people, it's just, we have all these. Now we're discussing the super rich, but when you want to think about high worth individuals and all these tax breaks that we have all across Europe, where you can basically move there and pay a flat tax, actually escape progressive income taxes. That's something that the Parliament has now started to raise, and probably it will be another 30 years. And so and the reason for that, there are actually two reasons why you would want taxation to be done at the jurisdictional level that encompasses the tax-based mobility. The first one is to avoid this run to the bottom. So, we really need to tax the tax base at a level where it's almost, it's more difficult, let's say, to evade taxes by using this international or inter-regional mobility margin, which can entail moving the firm or moving the individual, or can just entail moving its profits or his assets. On the one hand. And secondly, the other reason is precisely efficiency, as Aliston was saying. And if you look at the writings of the OECD, for instance, when they first started worrying about tax competition in the 90s, it was really about productive efficiency. And this is the reason. We did this amazing globalization, architecture precisely to foster efficiency, because we want production factors to move around to where the economic opportunities are, and that's what creates value in a market economy. And if they are moving around to escape taxes, then they're just distorting that mechanism. So that's, there are very, very good reasons why. And when you think, so if we even move around from the European Union, move away from or beyond the European Union, think about the world level, we have they're all now in ruins, but we have a World Trade Organization. So we have agreements, for instance, for climate change, so there's this understanding that there are policies that create, we call them externalities, but where what one country does has an impact on what the other country does, and we created multinational organizations to try to deal to find partial agreements. Of course, you cannot force countries to actually respect whatever, but we created these instances, and taxation has been out of that equation, and that's just, it's really abnormal. It shouldn't be that way. It's grotesque, actually, in terms of the design of the multinational organizations. So I think it's really good that the G20. So this is to answer a little bit. Who is going to lose? Of course. The ideal is to have the maximum possible number of countries that join together, but it's true that mobility is much lower than what is sometimes implied. For instance, intra-European mobility is much higher because because it's nice to live in most European countries, but most low-tax countries are much less nice to live than rich European countries. And also there's a market thing. You can't just. Again, if you really look at the actual activity of the firms and of the people, they just cannot pretend that they're not operating in the European Union because that's where part of the market is. Of course, the European Union is declining and etc. But it's still a rich market where you have to operate there. So things have to happen here. It's not that just people fly away because of taxes. There are other reasons that make production factors locate across the globe. So so basically we just have to harness that. So that would be. Let me just. I think that it's important that we move. And of course, the highest, the sort of largest possible set of countries is better. But if we just move, for instance, at the European Union level, that would already be helpful, and that would already help us, tax not all, but at least intra-European Union mobility and the fact that we have cooperation at the bank and at the banking level and so on, you know, you of course you will never, it's never going to be perfect, but you can move in that direction. So yeah, but about gender, I think everything has been said. So let me also tell you, I mean, I'm skeptical. I'm not an expert. I don't know how to negotiate with the far right. I'm skeptical because they put the enemy elsewhere, as Alison was saying. For them, the savings come from saving money on the poor rather than taxing the rich, which is a bit, you know, it's really changing completely the angle. So it's a bit difficult to start negotiating. And also, they are profoundly anti-multilateral, so they don't want this, you know, they are really nationalist. And the taxation, you know, fair taxation and progressivity nowadays, because of mobility, because we created this architecture of mobility, you cannot tax progressively if you don't do it with some sort of international cooperation. Yeah, but I mean, I don't know. I'm not an expert, you know, in negotiation.
Agora sim, vou passar para português, com um comentário muito rápido em relação à questão da relocalização, só enfatizar o que a Susana acabou de dizer. A União Europeia é um mercado interno, que aliás até vai para lá da União Europeia, incluindo Noruega, Islândia, e através dos tratados que faz, tem influência também numa série de outros mercados. Não dá para ignorar nas atividades que as empresas que estão ligadas a estes super ricos fazem um mercado de cerca de 500 milhões de pessoas, algumas das quais são das que têm mais poder de consumo no mundo. E, portanto, isso também nos permite perceber que nós não estamos completamente desesperados, sem, digamos, sem peso para alavancar na relação, na dinâmica com os super ricos. Se nós pensarmos em algo tão simples quanto o duelo Alexandre de Moraes, do Supremo Tribunal Federal Brasileiro, Elon Musk, um dos homens mais ricos do mundo, durante ali um mês ou dois à volta de se o Twitter operava no Brasil ou não, na verdade o Elon Musk acabou por escolher cumprir com as determinações do Supremo Tribunal Federal Brasileiro, porque representa, apesar de tudo, um mercado de 200 e tal milhões de pessoas com acesso à internet. Mas, se pensarmos bem, em termos numéricos, menos de metade do mercado europeu e com bastante menos poder de consumo do que o mercado europeu. Ou seja, numa dinâmica de poder entre o mercado interno da União Europeia, mesmo que estivesse sozinho, e algumas destas grandes fortunas, não se aguenta o argumento de que simplesmente eles se iam embora, marimbavam-se para a União Europeia e escolhiam apenas funcionar com o mercado do Dubai, que não sei, quer dizer, que é menor do que o de Portugal, embora tenha muitos mega ricos. Os mega ultra super ricos vão buscar o dinheiro deles a algum lado, e esse dinheiro a algum lado é no consumo que as centenas de milhões de seres humanos fazem em mercados como o europeu. E, portanto, é importante notar isso. Essa é outra forma de pressão que temos, que é o mercado interno que construímos a partir de 57 e do Tratado de Roma. Bem, gostaria de dizer-vos que nós não vamos largar este tema. É um tema que, pela sua parcial novidade, ele às vezes tem dificuldade a ser... Quer dizer, primeiro temos que estabelecer os termos do debate para depois podermos fazer o próprio debate. Estou relativamente habituado a receber discurso de ódio, mas ultimamente fiquei muito surpreendido com o discurso de ódio que se recebe quando se toca nestes super, hiper, mega ricos, e a maior parte desse discurso de ódio não vem de pessoas que não são sequer medianamente ricas, quanto mais. E, portanto, isso significa que há um grande trabalho a fazer em termos de poder simplificar a forma como comunicamos este tipo de tema. O LIVRE vai tentar fazê-lo através da edição de um jornal a que o Jorge já se referiu, que vamos chamar o Lê, o jornal LIVRE, é um convite. E uma das coisas que vamos ter é um jogo de tabuleiro, em que temos precisamente a democracia e a oligarquia globais a disputarem-se uma à outra, um pouco baseado na história do monopólio que foi desenvolvido inicialmente por Elizabeth McGee, uma feminista e georgista. Os georgistas Era um debate muito parecido a este que estamos a ter, mas sobre o imposto sobre terra há 100 anos, e ela fez um jogo de tabuleiro em que a prosperidade e o monopólio eram duas equipas em confronto. Houve alguém que lhe roubou o jogo e usou apenas a metade do monopólio, como nós conhecemos hoje. Portanto, estejam atentos e atentas a isso, porque vamos publicar em breve. Queremos ter mais eventos na Assembleia da República abertos ao público. É bom estarmos aqui nesta belíssima sala do Senado com alguns dos setembristas de que a gente fala todos os anos na nossa escola de verão, e outros não. E queremos agradecer aos nossos oradores e oradoras de hoje pela presença, à Benedetta, ao Guilherme e aqui ao Quentin, à Alison e à Susana. Também, muito em particular, agradecer ao Jorge Pinto, que agora é um deputado em licença parental, que ajudou a organizar esta sessão, que tem sido magnificamente substituído pelo Círculo do Porto, pela Filipa Pinto, que aqui está, e na Comissão de Orçamento e Finanças, pelo Paulo Moares, que também aqui está, e o trabalho que este trio tem desenvolvido também para permitir que se faça este evento, segurando as pontas uns dos outros, tem sido bonito de ver e admirável. E agradecer também à Isabel, nossa líder parlamentar, pela moderação da mesa anterior. Muito obrigado a todos e a todas, e se houver mais perguntas depois, aproveitem os momentos bilaterais.